Hello and welcome to the 61st episode of Red Hoop Talk here on whatever streaming device you're using, whether it's Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter. We're coming to you live, and my name is Shannon O'Loughlin. I'm a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and the Chief Executive Officer and Attorney for the Association on American Indian Affairs, the oldest nonprofit serving Indian country. Glad you're all with us tonight. We have an extremely special episode that I'm so happy to bring to you tonight. But first, let me acknowledge the peoples whose land I am standing on. That's the land of the Piscataway peoples here, what's known as Maryland, north of Washington, D.C. I hope everyone's doing well out there. It looks like the weather is kind of nice and doing well across the country, I hope. And I hope everyone's safe and feeling healthy and happy tonight. Man, it's been a difficult journey we've been on the past year and a half. And Red Hoop Talk kind of came out of the pandemic and the need to want to bring together some community and people from all over Indian country, whether you're urban or res Indian, or whether you're just a member of the public and you don't quite understand who Native people are. This is a forum where we can bring on guests and people from natives from all over Indian country doing important work on issues that are important to us. And thanks, Lance. Lance is trying not to melt. I think Lance is coming from the Southwest. And turn on the air conditioner, get you a cold soda, and thanks for joining us tonight, Lance. So we are going to be talking tonight about repatriation. And I just wanted to give a little kind of 101 about what repatriation is, because the word in kind of mainstream whatever the hell is, means, the original definition means to return someone home to their own country. So it's been used to return folks from combat who've either passed on or have been in detention or in some other kind of military camp, return them home. We use the term differently now in Indian country, but it essentially means the same thing, to return home. And the use of the word repatriation really came out of efforts that have happened since colonial era, when items and our ancestors were being removed from graves, their burial belongings were becoming tokens of violence and war, and creating an art market that continues to exist today and continues to cause harm in Indian country. But the word really got a huge boost with some efforts of individuals involved in the 60s and 70s with American Indian religious freedoms. And one of those people, very special to me, I've looked up to her all my life, SUZAN SHOWN HARJO, who is Cheyenne Hodulgee Muscogee. She has been a person who's been at the forefront building the foundation of what we know repatriation to be today, mainly through the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And that act actually came about due to a few things coming together in history. There was the American Indian Religious Freedoms movement that was not successful. And then in the 80s, the George Gustav High Museum of the American Indian in New York City was being sold and given over to the Smithsonian Institution. And through that process, repatriation came to be a point of advocacy, that we wanted these items that George Gustav High stole by the train load full back to their home nations and communities. this issue and the definition of repatriation just continues to grow and change. The Association on American Indian Affairs uses the term repatriation to mean more than just NAGPRA. It is a meaning beyond NAGPRA, and it's about returning culture and the things that make us who we are as Native peoples. The return of our languages, the return of our children who died in boarding schools. We've all heard about the children at Kamloops Indian Residential School in Canada and British Columbia. And those 215 children, the boarding school went on in Canada, but there's also, I believe, about 357 boarding schools that we know within the U.S., all with their marked and unmarked graves of our Native youth and children. So repatriation is taking on a bigger term and a bigger point of advocacy in our work that we do in Indian country. If you've watched Native News Online, there was an article today about the repatriation of children from the Carlisle Indian School. 10 more children are being returned home from that, what's now Federal Army Corps owned property. But that's enough of that. I'm reading from a paper here, if you can't tell that already. Hey, JD. Hey, everyone. So let me pause right there with all this talk about repatriation. And if you know me at all, I can go on and on about matters of repatriation and NAGPRA, international repatriation, the problem with collectors, dealers, and auction houses, and just keep going. I don't want to do that tonight. I want to hear from SUZAN Harjo. So why don't we get started with that? But first, I want to thank all of you who watch us on Red Hoop Talk, live or streaming. I would invite you during the show. We're going to be showing a recording of SUZAN. Please chat your comments, chat your questions. I'm going to be watching and also watching the chat so we can respond and chat together. So please take that opportunity. We'd love to hear from you. And please feel free to introduce yourself. Let us know who you are, where you're coming from, your tribal affiliation. And we're really glad to have you tonight. So without further ado, I think I snorted a little there. It's always a little wild and raucous here, isn't it? Let me introduce this video. So what I'm going to show you is a video that took place last year during the Association on American Indian Affairs 6th Annual Repatriation Conference that commemorated the 30th anniversary of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, also lovingly, I guess, called NAGPRA. We did our conference last year in partnership with the University of Denver Department of Anthropology. We had more than 730 people participating and attending in that conference last year. It was a real wonderful success. We're having another one this year, and it's going to be all virtual, and we hope that you all will participate in that as well. This was our first keynote of the conference last year, and we wanted SUZAN to tell and talk about her story because she was at the center of the struggle to educate Congress and lead the change for repatriation and return of our ancestors. She's, like I said, Cheyenne and Hodulgee Muscogee. She's president of the Morning Star Institute and an advocate for American Indian rights, poet, writer, lecturer, curator, and policy advocate. Usually I take time to read a poem that she wrote. And if you Google it, it's called Child of Time. I invite you to read SUZAN's poem called A Child of Time, because it really is the driver of the advocacy work that SUZAN has done in her life, and especially with repatriation. As part of this video, Mr. Phil Deloria facilitated the conversation with Suzanne. If you don't know who Phil Deloria is, he's the son of Vine Deloria, and he is a professor at, is he a professor? He's Dakota. He's a professor of Native American and Indigenous Studies, Department of History Chair, Committee on Degrees in History and Literature at Harvard University. No wonder I forgot where he was teaching at. Okay, enough of that. So let's get started on this video. The title is called The Need for Religious Freedom and Human Rights, The Reckoning of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. I hope that you all will enjoy this video. Here we go.
Right. Thank you so much, Shannon. I appreciate it. And welcome to all the folks who are out here joining us. Coming to you today from Northern Michigan, from Anishinaabe lands. And I am so excited to have this conversation with my friend Suzan Harjo. We've had the great pleasure of chatting over the last couple days and weeks about some of the things that we might talk about in the conversation today. So we're going to want to talk about and touch on a number of the aspects of the history behind NAGPRA and the way that it actually speaks to our present moment. We want to talk a bit about alliance building, about repatriations that took place before the act, about the place of the NMAI Act, about the development of the legislation, various issues, tribal capacity, intent. There's so much to talk about. Before we jump in, though, I'm wondering, Suzanne, if I might ask if you would speak for a moment on some of your earliest engagements with the moral and ethical questions and histories that underpin repatriation, which seem to, in some ways, kind of crystallize around Bear Butte in 1967. Spiritual components, collectivities, meetings, dreams, visions, all kinds of things that in some ways are maybe a kind of grounding for the conversation that we're going to have today.
Thanks, Phil. And I'm so happy to be having this conversation with you. And to Shannon, I would just like to express my deep thanks for giving us this opportunity to reflect on 30 years. Well, and for me, it goes back to 1965 when my mother and I went to the Museum of the American Indian in New York, and she saw some things that either were or resembled things that her grandfather might have been buried with and in. And at the same time, I saw something that was very disturbing, a buckskin dress a Cheyenne girl would have worn, and there was a hole where her belly had been, a bullet hole and blood. And we left as quickly as we could, and on the way out saw, it was a parade of horribles. We saw a shrunken head and a mummy and more shrunken heads and false face masks and all sorts of things that really shouldn't be there. And when we got outside, my mother was quite stern with me about getting busy and doing something about that aberration, getting those things out of there. They don't belong there. They need to be saged and buried. They need to be burned. They need to be done with what they were supposed to have been, and they need to be returned to sanctified ground. or scaffolds or caves or wherever they came from. She went home and to Oklahoma and organized with some of the chiefs and other people, some of the headsmen, a meeting that ended up taking place in 1967 at Bear Butte in South Dakota. And it's a very important place to about 60 different Native peoples, most particularly to the Cheyenne and Lakota and Arapaho and Kiowa. And it's just north of the Black Hills. And from the top of it, and it's not very high, it's about 4,500 feet high, but you can see all over the plains. It's the tallest thing on that part of the plains. You can see forever, and you can see all the way to Bear Medicine Lodge. So Bear Butte was is a place that is now a state park, but it remains a holy place. Holy places are always sacred places. They never lose their sacredness, even if they are razed, even if they are what people call destroyed. They're never totally destroyed. They're always imbued. They're always sacred, so long as the people hold them sacred. And that's one of the bedrocks of NAGPRA, is that it's up to the people to say what is and what is not sacred.
I should say for the folks who are with us, this is the pictures that are scrolling through here are pictures from Suzanne's collection, and some of them have to do with the context that we're talking about, but many of them, if not most of them, are family pictures, and it's quite an extraordinary archive, and we're just going to have them scroll through as we're talking a little bit. Suzanne, I wonder if you can maybe walk us through some of the sort of immediate chronology that led up to the act. After this moment with your mom in '65 and Bear Butte in '67, what happened next, and who was critical to that efforts, and what kind of issues were you dealing with? Who are the central players as you tried to figure out how to sort of reverse all of this history that we've been looking at?
Well, the Bear Butte, thank you for that question. The Bear Butte gathering was called for by religious leaders who were Cheyenne and Lakota and Arapaho. And although there were other people there, just because they were, a visiting friend of a friend, but this was a meeting after ceremonies, and people were asked, at the urging of many people, including my mother, to have meetings about disturbing things that people were seeing in visions and dreams and nightmares, sometimes of ancestors calling, sometimes of medicines that were being locked up and held, people that were being held against their will. And this was it was an important gathering because it was so reflective of our time. Most of the people don't know what 1967 was like, but you couldn't go down the highway anywhere in America without being bombarded with billboard images saying "shrunken head, mummies, move, turn next left, next right." And this is how museums and collectors were as well. And not just in the old days, not just in the 60s or the 70s, but into the 90s and into the 2000s. I went to a party in Santa Fe where a very famous person with a huge collection of cremation pots gathered this party into this gigantic, almost hangar-like area with big shelves and these pots. And he reached into one and showed us, he held up his fingers and said, "This is how you know it's authentic, that it's a real artifact." Well, of course, it's not an artifact. That's though what he was holding up was what was left of human beings in that pot. And this sort of thing is so appalling. We were dealing with that. We were dealing with stresses. The Vietnam War was a huge stress that was making the country of the United States fight itself. And we had lots of Native people who were there fighting. And they were the ones at our gathering at Bear Butte who gave us the image of calling our ancestors who were in these holding repositories, museums and other collections, calling them prisoners of war. And that's how we began to think of them, and that we were trying to liberate them. That was our mission. That was one of our missions. And we were trying to get back those things that had been stolen from our people when our religions and ceremonies were banned, and everything that people would dance with and would use during the ceremony would be confiscated and go into private collections and maybe go into a museum. So at our gathering at Bear Butte, we really set the tone for repatriation law, although it would be years before we would use that term, repatriation. What we talked about was give them back, give it back, put it back, put them back. We talked about all of the ways that we needed to be in the world in order to survive it, and what we need to reclaim, what we needed to reclaim. It was a moral imperative, a family obligation, a national directive. And after that gathering, some of us were sent out to go to other places. Ray Spang and I were sent, he was a Northern Cheyenne man, and he and I were sent to Zuni to start out. And we went to other pueblos, but there was a Zuni man with one of our Native veterans at the at Bear Butte. And so we went there first and were very well received. And that was the case everywhere we went, which was in New Mexico, various pueblos in Arizona, and in California, Oregon, Washington State, and then over Idaho and Montana. That was our trek. And we learned much. What we found out was everyone was thinking in the same general way, and we just needed to understand what each other's priorities were. Some people really wanted the return of human remains and the precious things the people had been buried with, and some wanted the ceremonial items back, some wanted the medicines back, and some wanted the land back. So there were very different priorities. We tried to do all of that in repatriation law, and everything that's in there stands for someone. The Warm Springs people were having trouble with the Army Corps of Engineers, and who said when they offered to take responsibility to do reburial ceremonies and rebury people that the Army Corps had dug up across the river from them, the Army Corps rebuffed them and said, no, these aren't your people. And they said, well, they were just across the river. We knew them. We had to know them. And they said, no, there's none of them left, and they're not your people. I said, well, then all the more reason that we have a responsibility to them. So out of that kind of situation is where we came up with cultural affiliation, that we do have a responsibility to each other, and especially if there is a language connection, if there's a person connection, of course you can go across the river and you can be married, you can have children with people on the other side of the river. And how odd for someone to think that these great navigators and fisher families couldn't make it across a river and to know each other. So there were all of those kinds of things that we had to keep in mind and store up and make sure that no matter what we were doing, we were thinking of Warm Springs and what we eventually called cultural affiliation, that we were thinking of these cremation pots and what we came to call the surrogates, and why in NAGPRA surrogates for the human remains have the same weight as human remains and are valued the same, because they are the people and need to be treated. They're standing for the people. So this is some of what we had. We had to change the language. I mean, what do you do when you want to legislate respect? Well, you don't use the disrespectful words. You don't use grave goods if you don't want people to act like pirates. You don't use that term. And we got a lot of pushback from scientists about not using grave goods, as if that were a scientific term. They had used it so long, they thought it was a scientific term of art. We've met some astonishing people and had some astonishing encounters. And a lot of them revolved around language. Most of the people we met with over time in various formal and informal meetings, if they were physical anthropologists or archaeologists who were opposed to repatriation, they were like some specific scientist who disassociated themselves by name, by footnote from our report to Congress from something called the National Dialogue between museums and Native Americans. And that was something that the scientists in Arizona and New Mexico had convinced Senator John McCain of Arizona and Congressman Morris K. Udall of Arizona, our allies and friends, that our momentum needed to be slowed down, and would they have a national dialogue at the Heard Museum in Phoenix. And so for our side, we said, oh, sure, let's go ahead and do that. And we met with them, and it was fascinating, interesting, until it wasn't. And we ran out of time and patience and went back to Washington and got the National Museum of the American Indian Act and the first repatriation, the historic repatriation policy in that act, the agreement with the Smithsonian. So that was done, and that's good. And then we returned to the National Dialogue and wrote the report, had some of the scientists who were there say we're not going to go along with the term human remains because that means that international standards of human rights will apply to Indians, and they didn't believe they should or did. And in short, it means when you're buried, you get to stay buried. And they thought that was an unreasonably harsh standard.
So it sounds
Oh,
like,
go ahead.
there was, this sort of very interesting period of, on the one hand, sort of, a lot of consultation, a lot of tribal consultation, alliance building, information gathering, a set of experiences with federal agencies, with museums, with scientists, archaeologists, and so on, which, led to your sense that, there are moments where the language really needed to be changed away from grave goods, away from human remains, and that those changes in the language actually changed the concepts that were at play, things like cultural affiliation or human rights or freedom of religion. And then, of course, this sort of the national dialogue as both a dialogue, but also something of a political kind of stratagem, it sounds like, in a way. I was wondering, there are repatriations and other victories that happen along the way before NAGPRA, repatriation, kinds of victories and challenges. And I'm wondering maybe if you could talk a minute about how you see the role of those efforts in relation to the development of the legislation and the passage of the law, right? In what ways were some of those things formative? And, were there maybe some specific kinds of repatriations that really proved to be, absolutely critical as you look back on it now?
Yes, indeed. The first one that comes to mind is the first repatriation of a Zuni war god from an auction house was done by Anne Maytag, the appliance heiress, who had a beautiful penthouse place in New York City and an even more beautiful place in Santa Fe, and was a great patron of the arts. And she was aghast that there was at an auction house she frequented, a Zuni war god, a very important sacred object to the people at Zuni, up for sale. And it was highly prized in the art world, as all of them were. They were taken from their perches as sentinels. They were taken from graves. They were taken from lookout points. They were taken for the purpose they were made, and they were left to deteriorate, and that would symbolize a person's journey, a deceased person's journey. And they would be looking out for the good of all the people. And those, so she was trying to convince some of us to go and take it. And we said we couldn't. And she didn't know why. And we said, because we'd end up in jail. Why don't you go take it? And she said, well, you're right. Because all they're going to do with me is just send me a bill saying, dear Miss Maytag, when you were last in our establishment, you might have missed our invoice, and here it is, and here's how much we'd like to receive from you, either by check or call us. And so she went in and the night of the auction and took it. And she told him, I'm taking this and I'm giving it to the Zunis. And she walked out with it. And then it was given to one who gave it to one who gave it to one who flew it back to Zuni Pueblo and gave it to the wise leadership there. And they they were very happy about that. And the thing that made us know that that was hugely important was that no one ever sent her a bill.
Mm-hmm.
No, she was shocked, and she was prepared to pay it, actually, or to make the point, but she didn't really want to make the point and have a lawsuit unless it was going to lead to something and be a winning thing. So, so she thought she would be prepared to pay it. So that was important because why? They didn't want to claim anywhere in a formal way. What they had been claiming all along is we have title to this, because they had gotten it, you know, they're a holding repository. They had gotten it from a fence, who had gotten it from a fence, who had gotten it from a thief, who had gotten it from another thief, and on and on and on. And someone along the line gave them paper, and they called it title.
Mm-hmm.
So we knew that there was something in that that was very important, and that became even clearer when Native American Rights Fund filed a complaint on behalf of Zuni Pueblo in the late 1970s, and against one museum, the Denver Art Museum. And Denver Art, we learned later, had their legal people talk to the 10 majors, and what that meant, what they used to call each other, the 10 majors, that meant the museums and schools with the largest, most numerous Indian collections. And in talking with fellow 10 majors, which, and I think there were many more than that, they decided that they didn't want to press a legal title or good title, bad title lawsuit. And so they agreed to repatriate the war god. And so that told us very clearly that we were definitely on the right track about their inability to make a case on title. And that was brought home in a variety of ways, most notably in the later Tunica Treasures case, where an amateur archaeologist, which I think just means grave robber, right? And an amateur archaeologist dug up Tunica treasures, meaning bodies and things, property of the deceased, and claimed it as his own and gave it to Harvard and asked that they take care of it for him. And ultimately, a judge found that the Tunica treasures belonged to the Tunica. Well, what a novel idea. And what we were trying to do in NAGPRA is not to establish ownership of things, but to establish rights regarding and responsibilities regarding. And if the belonging went anyway, it went that the people, the living people, belonged to the items and the people and the living beings that were being sought, that were being held, that were being contemplated for return, that were being desired for return. So all of these things were important pieces to figure out how you build the door, the legislative door, to everything that's inside, all of the protections that are inside. And you would hear from one place, one people, that they needed this kind of thing, and it was distinct. we had lots of things in common, but then there would always be something distinct. So that would add another kind of shape to the door. And it didn't matter that we were getting lots and lots of different shapes and a bigger door and more doors. And what mattered was that everyone could get through it with everything they needed and had a piece of this through language, through examples.
How this kind of change works, right? Building a body of decisions, establishing and making visible a set of rights and responsibilities, a set of principles, giving examples of how those principles, can be operationalized in practice through some of these, sort of smaller and earlier, kinds of wins. So, and you talked, I think, quite evocatively about sort of opening the door, making the door wider. So how did you know when the door was wide enough, so that all could go through? How did you know when you'd won the day? Was there a particular, set of moments or conjunction that let you think like, yes, this is going to happen, right? We've gotten to the place, of success.
Well, after several decades of meeting all around Indian country, and at different levels of meetings, spiritual leaders and legislative experts, litigation experts, cultural rights specialists, everyone brings a different kind of view to what it is you're doing. And when everyone starts applying their thoughts to how you can really achieve what you want, and you start putting this in writing in various ways. You put it in writing by doing a complaint, or by doing a press release, or by doing a resolution, or by doing letters, or by preparing bullet point one-pagers for people to take into their member of Congress to say, this is what we're looking for, this is what we need, and here's my experience, and I'll tell you why I need it and why my people need it. So how did we know when we had won? We knew we had won when the Museum of the American Indian returned wampum belts, first wampum belts returned. And then shortly thereafter, when the State Museum of New York returned wampum belts, we knew we had won. We knew we had won when we were able to have the language we wanted, when Congress paid attention to what we wanted as opposed to what our opponents wanted, when our opponents started splitting off, and some wanted just to talk with us and to figure out how to go about this. We kept insisting on inventories, for example, and in our last negotiation with AAM, the Museum Alliance, with the vice president and president, they were saying, well, what do you mean by the first inventory? I said, well, the whole point of this is to get the people together, the people who have the people and things in these repositories, to get them together with the people whose ancestors they are, who made these materials, who made these sacred objects, who hold them, who prize them, who hold them sacred, whose cultural patrimony they are. The title question was we made a whole new category called cultural patrimony, just to say, okay, all you people who are saying you have good title, you don't, because there are lots of things that no one can alienate, that belong to a group as a whole, and no one person or even a part of the group has the right to sell them or give them over or anything like that. So we knew we had won at various points.
One of the central issues around NAGPRA, and maybe this is the case with any legislation, is the question of intent. And particularly as we engage our contemporary and perhaps future Supreme Court, questions about intent. We've been talking, I think, a bit about tribal intent, but I wonder if you might say a few words about congressional intent and how you see that, what you think it really sort of means these days when we talk about congressional intent, how it was shaped and shifted, before, during, and after the passage of NAGPRA, and maybe reflect with us a little bit about your sense of how we understand the intent of the law as it was constructed then, as it exists and stands today.
When I was watching the hearing of the recent nominee for the Supreme Court justice position, Judge Coney Barrett, I was really uneasy hearing her talk about being an originalist and then talk about being a textualist, meaning there is no such thing as legislative history. There is no such thing really as congressional intent, when that's what most Native related laws rest on, is the congressional intent. And not only the congressional intent, but the Native people's intent. It's the modern version of the canon of construction at the Supreme Court. So Indians' treaties are to be interpreted as the Indians of the time understood them, that it's always so important that we tell what we mean at the time, and we tell what we meant at the time to do. So what the Native people believe is part of that, and we're trying to do, is hugely important. And what we were trying to do was what my mother's grandfather in that life cast was experiencing. And that was, even though there may have been economic coercion, and he was, after all, there with his family in a village of human exhibits in the World's Fair, showing the Smithsonian scale of evolution with the white people on top and the darker people on the bottom. And he was there in the Cheyenne village. But he did want to have his picture taken. He did agree to that. That was his choice, whatever the pressures. And he did consent to that. And that's what we were striving for in NAGPRA. Not the people who were forced into stripping down and having their pictures taken of their naked bodies, front, sideways, back, and the people whose mouths were opened and their molars counted, and whose unattached earlobes were measured, and whose baby blue spots were measured and compared, and whose heads were measured. All of those kind of things that represented the scientific state-of-the-art thinking at some point or another. We were trying to get to a point where the living people could say, as living people do everywhere, the descendants, the next of kin, these are my people, and here's how you can't treat them. Here's how we must treat them. Here's how you can't deal with them anymore. You can't own them like you own a butterfly collection. You can't keep them. You can't study them. You can't do that. Now, people fought us tooth and nail on this. I mean, we had throw a dart at a segment of society, and they were opposed to us at one point or another. The art world, the auction houses, the galleries, saying, you can't destroy anything by burying it or burning it or just holding it for yourselves and using it in religious ceremonies. That's art. That belongs to the people as a whole, to the world as a whole. You're interfering with our artistic freedom. And we'd always fall back on religious freedom and the constitutional protections. So what we tried to do is make a really strong record of what we thought we were doing and why, and what everyone who testified, everyone who had an opinion on this or that leading up to the law, about the first thing we had to do, which was the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which was to get a policy umbrella for the follow-on laws, such as repatriation laws, heritage language laws, the museum law. All of these are follow-ons to the Religious Freedom Act policy to preserve and protect the traditional religions and religious freedom, the exercise of the religious freedom for the people.
You were coming out of talking about, the Religious Freedom Act, and one of the conversations we had, the other day was the ways in which, perhaps some folks abandoned some of the possibilities of ERFA perhaps a little too soon, and that repatriation was one of these areas where it was worth thinking more about these things.
We had worked on this for so long. I mean, from 67 to 89, and then all of a sudden, there was the Museum Act, and there was the Smithsonian Agreement, and then within a year, there was NAGPRA. So after all of this time and painstaking work, then it became something moving at an immensely fast speed that no one could really pull back on or quite get ahead of. And a lot of our people were put in this position that even though this is what we all wanted and all talked about, and everything could be traced back to all of us saying one thing or another, people were still going, yay, we won, repatriation, great. What is it?
Right.
People just didn't know that that's what it was, that this stuff that we've been talking about and sharing histories about, and that now it was an actual thing. So it's hard to imagine that that was the case, given the growth industry that has been created in repatriation and cultural rights protection and advocacy. And I'm delighted every time I hear that another Native person has a job with their people doing this kind of work, because it wasn't always that way. It wasn't a huge priority for some, although it was the absolute top priority for others. What we have seen, though, in the meantime, is some people handling it, some peoples and some people handling things really, really well, and being able to utilize the act in all of the ways it was intended. With others, you can see the way that our opponents, who kept trying to tear down the act by lobbying against it, lobbying for, when they failed to defeat us, they lobbied for its repeal, beginning immediately after it was signed into law, NAGPRA, and continued that lobby effort by forming the scientists who were the Kennewick Man plaintiffs, and who were trying to keep the ancient one from being reburied by his descendants, the Umatilla and the Yakima and Colvilles and others in the Nez Perce and others in the Pacific Northwest in the Columbia River Basin area. They became, some of our people have depended on our worst adversaries. And I'm not talking about the ones who changed their minds, the ones who didn't believe us then and then figured out that we were really telling them the truth, being very straight with them. Your dad said to us one time, they think we're going to grab shopping carts and run up and down museum storage rooms, grabbing things off shelves. And he said, that's the image they have. And that's so far from what we're talking about. But that was something that our opponents really did think. And some of the people still are trying to water down the law, trying to get it undone. So the very people who tried to undo it, tried to, through the Kennewick Man case, tried to undo NAGPRA altogether by an absurd interpretation of the definition of Native American, meaning you're only Native American if you're as old as the Constitution. But if you're older, then you belong to the archaeological resources of the United States of America and have to go through the door of ARPA, the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, which we were trying to get away from in doing human rights law and getting away from the property rights merry-go-round of the scientists and of the art houses and all of those who were commodifying our people and things.
Well, this may, I mean, these observations, I think, about how things have unfolded may actually flow rather seamlessly or may even be sort of redundant relative to this last question I want to ask. And then we'll open up for questions from the audience. I believe Shannon's going to gather some of those up for us. So I think, I mean, I'm a historian, right? And historians don't predict the future. You say always over and over again, like, I don't know anything about the future. I have no idea what's going to happen because I only pay attention to the past. But in fact, if we're all being honest with ourselves, we think about our histories and our past in order to think about where we are in the present moment and where we might actually go. So I'm wondering if maybe you would just reflect with us a little bit about how you see this history that we've just spent some time chatting about. What do you think it suggests about the next 30 years, or maybe even to make it more immediate, maybe just the next decade or so? What should those of us who are involved in NAGPRA, be thinking about right now in terms of the future? You're a person who's had this strategic vision that's unfolded over a really long period of time, and I think most of us can only aspire, to something like that. But are there things we should be thinking about strategically for the future? Things we should be trying to fix, ideas that were central to the history you've just narrated that we should be trying to restore, or maybe new ideas and concepts we should be trying to advance. where do we go from here, knowing what we now sort of know about where we've been?
Well, the first thing I would suggest is to read the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That's something that Native peoples around the world worked on for a very long time, starting, I mean, a really long time ago, but with the National Congress of American Indians in this country, starting with accepting the request by the Canadian Indian Brotherhood to go to a meeting that turned out to be the formation meeting of the World Council of Indigenous Peoples in Port Alberni, Canada in 1975. And that was called because there was a UN rapporteur who was sending a questionnaire to countries, member countries of the UN, saying, do you have indigenous peoples? And if so, how do you treat them? And mostly they were being disavowed, and it was, but they would say, but we treat them well anyway, or if we had them, we would treat them well. But nothing specific in the way of real policy, and very few of the countries were involving Native peoples in that survey, in answering the question. So that sort of evolved into drafting sessions for the declaration, the draft declaration, as it was for a long, long time. But NAGPRA rests on this notion of consent. People talk about it being a voice for Native Americans, that it is a seat at the table. It's not that. It's the right to say no and the right to say yes. And if we look at the declaration, which I'm just suggesting we look to for language that the member nations of the UN agreed to in 2007, and the United States has endorsed, that it has language that we need to use as guidance for laws that exist now in the way that the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation did in the last administration, to take a position that they would use the declaration as guidance for all their work. And one thing that it says is, in dealing with sacred places, it says that sacred places should be returned if they were not taken by the state, country, with the free, prior, and informed consent of the people. So we need to start having consent agreements that will deal not only with sacred places, but with cultural patrimony, with areas that of sensitivity that we need to add to the laws that exist now. The first thing that has to happen for NAGPRA is Congress needs to have a field hearing, and it needs to have a DC hearing that's oversight. Do an oversight hearing right away in the next Congress, and then spend some time working with Native peoples to actually craft legislation, and then have legislative hearings on that draft. We have an opportunity to have, you have 30 plus years of experience repatriating people and things and living beings. And I don't know of another area that's quite like this, or another law that's quite like this. I mean, we wrote it not to be regulations. We wrote it as policy and to, as I said before, cover as many situations and peoples and tenets of religions as needed to be covered, as we knew about, and to understand that we didn't know enough to resolve things, that you had to turn it over to the people most intimately concerned with the subjects and objects at the earliest possible time, which is what we got stuck on in negotiating with AAM, because they couldn't understand what we meant by the first inventory. And when we explained that you send a letter to the Native people saying, "Dear tribal nation, we think we have some items in this category and that category and that category. You may have a number, may be, you know, some few items, some many items, 40 plus, that are yours. And we would like to discuss this. If you would like to talk about it, come see us. Love Museum."
Right.
And they said, the people on the other side of the table said, "Oh, you mean an archival inventory?" I said, "Well, what's an archival inventory?" And they explained that it was that is this. He said, "Well, of course we mean archival inventory." We didn't know that there was a difference in inventories. We just thought of it as the first one, the initial contact, and then the detailed, we have this many of this and that many of that. More arduous kind of inventory later. All we knew was that none of the holding repositories had any idea what they had in their basements and their attics and their holdings. They had no idea. And that's been proven true over and over again. So all of these things are really big opportunities for Congress to say, what has worked? What are the successful repatriations? What do you consider? I mean, the whole point of the laws, both the Smithsonian Agreement and NAGPRA, the whole point of those laws are the repatriation, is the repatriation. So what made it work over here and didn't work over here? Is it all about personality? Is it all about history? Is it, or is it the law itself? Do we need something else in the law? Do we need another way of looking at this? Do we need another term? Do we need other categories? So everyone will come with their own thoughts about their own experience, with no pressure to have to say, we're all in agreement now, we're very happy, and we did the repatriation, and now we're not going to fight anymore. No one has to do that. No
Right.
one has to, we just have to have a way of moving through this so that people respect completely in the law and in process and in relations the thinking and the values and the morality and the native laws, the religious laws, the ceremonial customs, and the ways of thinking that are quite different, and where they're the same, So that's what we were doing. We weren't, people always say you cannot legislate respect. And we didn't legislate respect, but we certainly legislated respectful terminology. So there's respect and there's respect. People have to acknowledge history and have to make up for their part of doing wrong throughout history. And a little of that goes a very long way with our people, because we have a lot of very forgiving people throughout Indian country. I mean, that's just, you know, it sort of goes along with the reverent people are really almost the most willing to go to any lengths to make a good peace. Part of it, we're in a massive, not only reckoning time, we're in a time of reclamation. We're in a time of cultural reclamation, of cultural restoration. We're piecing it together. We've just figured out who got through alive. And we're trying to figure out from similar cultural affiliates, if you will, what language sounds like if we no longer have language, but we know we have lots of words and they're written down and here they are. And there are many, many peoples who speak those languages that sound like ours. They're the same language stock. So there are ways of reviving that. I think that that's what a lot of people are doing. And I have witnessed, and many people have witnessed, the power of the return of a living being to its rightful place in a ceremony. And it's a stunning thing. And it illuminates the world. It brings, many of our people do nothing but pray for the good day for everyone. And they do it in certain locations and certain sacred places because those are power centers of the world and power centers of the universe. And that same thinking gets extended to the laws that we deal with, that there are people who are just praying that things go well and that they're praying for the good health and the well-being and the good mind for people who are doing things for the people.
You know, Suzanne, those are powerful words as always. I want to thank you for the conversation, and of course, thank you for your friendship and mentorship of me over the years. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
There's been a lot of discussion about confidentiality with NAGPRA and tribal practitioners sharing sacred information that then can be basically taken away from them or written down and shared where it wasn't supposed to go. So my question is, did NAGPRA consider issues of confidentiality, were issues that are sacred and confidential supposed to have been part of the consultation between tribes and museums in order to obtain repatriation?
That, yes. Part of the discussion, part of the ongoing obtaining of consent. A lot of people think consent means a veto. Well, yeah, it does, because yes is yes and no is no. And it is up to others to state what they want or what they're interested in. And once you've put the question to a Native nation, then it's up to them to say yes or no. That's consent. And it's not It's not anything unusual. It's not anything strange. On confidentiality, no one else is asked, what do you do in your ceremonies? No other religions have to say, here's how we define sacred, here's how we define holy, here's a detail of where I stand and where you stand and what I do and why and what I think about and how many years we've been doing this. There's none of that that is needed in order for holding repositories to remove the impediments they have placed in the way of the exercise of religious freedom over the years, and to remove the barriers that they have erected that stand in the way of people trying to live their lives and carry out the teachings and the desires and wishes of the best people they ever knew and continue to know. These are, I don't know what makes some people think that they're entitled to secret information. If it's a secret, it's a secret. If it's private, it's private. And that should be good enough. Just as we don't have to define the sacred, but we can help you understand it by describing something or explaining it or providing an example of it. But as far as defining it, we don't have to do that. And on confidentiality, there shouldn't be a need for anyone to have confidential information. And if there is, there's no reason it can't be held in camera in perpetuity by the agreed upon authorities. If there's a willingness to reveal certain things in order to have a certain ruling, for example, in a particular case or matter, or repatriation, then that's part of that consent agreement. You know, we're going to, there was one picture where Jemez Pueblo people came to the Museum of the American Indian right after the collection was nationalized and asked for repatriation of a couple of hundred items, sacred objects. And some people gasped in the boardroom and they hundreds, what? And some of us gasped because just thinking that we were trustees of a museum that had that many sacred objects of people we knew, and people who were doing millennial ceremonies with millennial history. And so what they decided was they wanted to have a press conference to explain that they were very happy with this, that finally when everything was repatriated, and they wanted to show one of the items, and they did at this press conference, and told people that they could look at it, they could discuss it, and that was what they had decided. But that was it, just the one. And that was their decision. That was a decision that they came to. Whether anyone else understood it is of no consequence and shouldn't matter at all. And if they had said, no one gets to see any of this ever again, because they've been exploited all these years and photographed and written about and poked and prodded, and now we're taking them home. Those are private religious matters and community matters. Those are nation matters. Those are family matters. Those are moiety matters. It depends on your society or your longhouse or your particular people.
Do you have any advice for the younger generations that are just getting started with this work? Always an important question.
Come up with as many original ideas as you can, and then tell them to one of your elders or a lot of your elders and see if they are original. And if they're not, where they came from, how it is you think that's an original idea of a way things could be done, should be done. If you have a passion for something, you're the one to get it done. If you've had a recurring dream about something, it means something, and maybe that's a calling for you. Visions aren't just in the old days. It's something that this happens today. It happens with regularity. It shouldn't be a surprise when people have visionary experiences. And we have to be very cautious to not place our trust in people undeserving of our trust. We have to be very careful to have what the Buddhists talk about: right relations, right money, right associates, right path, right everything. That is the way to go forward in the world. And I really admire the Haudenosaunee for so many reasons, but one image I have from listening to many of their instructions is that you must continue in a certain path and not listen to the voices of distraction. And you don't look to the right and you don't look to the left. You just continue down your path. And anytime you hear a voice of distraction, you put it aside. You ignore it. And I think those are very wise things. One of the Cheyenne's first instructions was to walk gently through life. And that's always a good idea, no matter how. It takes a lot of strength to be gentle if you might encounter a bear, or if you might encounter something that's going to that has the potential for killing you. You have to think about things that and when they might have been said, and what they meant at that time and what they mean now. And I think just go forward and do amazing new things. I mean, who knew? Someone once asked how I planned all of these things out, and you don't plan everything out, or you'd never start down that particular road. You only see how things developed when you're looking back over a very long time. And once you're doing that and able to have a reflection, there are lots of things you learn, like, oh, this actually happened because of that, not because I made it happen or so-and-so made it happen. This was the dynamic, this was the thing in the world. This was, I didn't know that there was a tornado next door. It could be a life force. It could be a natural occurrence. You just never know. One time, Rick Hill, who is a wonderful expert and authority on wampum, and used to be the deputy director for the National Museum of the American Indian, and I were working on a show at the Peabody Essex in Salem, Massachusetts. And as we walked by certain storage areas, we would hear rustling sounds, almost like things were getting ready to go home. Almost as if saying, oh, okay, let's gather ourselves together because maybe we're leaving here. You never know. You never know what you're going to discover if your mind and your heart are very open to unusual occurrences. Vine Deloria Jr. used to tell me that I was so event prone that he was worried about me. And I think that that's the reason I'm still around, to be able to look back and try to figure out exactly what happened to us and how it happened and what we brought about and what was magic. And I always love the magic part, because there's a lot of that. So go forward, young people, and work hard and find good magic.
Wow. Go forward and find that good magic. Thank you so much for joining us tonight on our 61st episode of Red Hoop Talk. Glad you all could join us and spoke out on the chats. It was great to hear from you all. My name's Shannon O'Loughlin. I'm the Executive Director, Chief Executive, whatever you want to call me, for the Association on American Indian Affairs. We hope that you will look, I'll share real quick, look and find more information about the association's annual repatriation conference that we hold every year. This year is our 7th annual repatriation conference, accountable to our past and committed to our future. There's opportunities for sponsorship. There are many opportunities for community and learning more about repatriation. Suzanne may be speaking again at this year's repatriation conference, so you may not want to miss that. Thanks for joining us tonight. And with that, Helito, everyone, and I guess Yakoki. It was nice to be here. Have a wonderful Friday night and the rest of your weekend. We will see you next week with another lawyer. Finally, I get to bring another lawyer in here with me. We've been absent of other lawyer guests for a while, so we're going to have a wonderful young lawyer joining us. Her name's Rose Petoskey. And looking forward to that conversation. See you then. Have a great week, and we will end broadcast.